Okay. So yeah, to answer your question of how to find a routine in good thinking, design thinking is of course one of the great tools to enable and to facilitate creative thought processes. But at the same time, of course, to make these creative thought processes translate into something that we can use, something that, creates, say, value in the end from an economical perspective. So first of all, you start by breaking habits. As in Woody Allen said, you should never get too comfortable. And that essentially means that you have to, present yourself with challenges every day to avoid thinking in patterns and heuristics that you are comfortable with. Now, what happens if you do that is quite simple. You will have it very difficult to actually break out of your own reality. As in, we all have our own culture, background, and way of looking at the world. From a research perspective, that would be the traditional bias that every person has. And there's a really simple way of actually breaking out of it. It's like talking to people who have a different background, a different culture, and a different education. So in research, you would call that triangulation. In business or in design thinking, we just call it interdisciplinarity. So it's a way, quite simply, of having to translate your thoughts and your systems and whatever is normal to you and absolutely perfectly obvious to you into something that people who are, say, from a different background can understand. So what you would want to do is you would actually want to explain, and you have to explain your thinking in more fundamental terms. As in, you have to explain things that for you are not needed to be explained. So how you would do that is essentially that you create, say, a climate where you try to communicate across disciplines and cultures. That's the first thing. Because it actually makes you aware of your assumptions that you don't question. The second thing, however, is that you use methods which allow only for very short time frames within which you can develop ideas. And you also want to use certain artificial constraints. Like in business, we always have constraints, but sometimes people think that in order to be creative, these constraints need to be removed. It's not necessarily true. If I were to tell you now to build a house and you would have an unlimited budget and you could live anywhere, it would be very hard for you to actually develop a concrete picture of what that house would be like, because you could never decide. But if I told you, okay, you have this and this budget, say 1 million euros, it can only be in Spain, it can only be 2 stories high, it can only be 50 kilometers away from the coastline, it can only be in this region, you could suddenly develop something from that. So in order for creativity to flourish, we ironically need very rigid constraints.
Okay, so could you build these constraints for yourself? Let's say you live day in, day out, and you tell yourself, okay, I'm gonna talk to a strange person every day because I think it's gonna help my creative thinking process. I'm going to set myself the unnatural constraint, which would be like, okay, I talk to this person in a trend maybe.
So what you can do is you can put yourself in uncomfortable situations. For example, you can start talking to strangers. Now, first of all, it's going to be for many people something they're not comfortable with. It's a core part of design thinking work is to get people out to observe and to talk to people. But there's a very simple thing you can do already. It's just to select a location of your choice and spend 1 hour observing people there. We observe things in everyday life and we walk through the world, but we never actually spend a long time just sitting or standing at a place observing people. You will suddenly gain a much more fundamental and really interesting and enlightening understanding of whatever system you're observing there. And you will see patterns. Now, it's not necessarily the case that you will see the same patterns as someone next to you standing. But the beauty is if you do it with your friends and not talk within the process, or maybe even stand at different angles of that same location, you will find entirely different results to some extent. But then you will also find that certain observations are very fundamental, as in everyone will have a grasp of them. And that's also the beauty of unifying perspectives, is that as much as you will look diversely at something, you might find patterns that you all observe, and those are the most interesting and most promising ones because they are the most generalizable. So I often get the question okay, if we use design thinking to create human-centered innovation, right? And if we really talk to people and discover their individual needs, and how can that be a generalized applicability? How can these products and solutions that we develop be actually good for everyone? So this is essentially the way I like to explain it. It's as much as the individuality, will of course say make solutions more attractive for some people than for others, the core idea of design thinking is to first gather all the personal information about the people you're talking to in a qualitative research manner, and then actually extract the fundamental patterns that you actually get from, say, different target groups. This is how perhaps Apple did the iPhone, you know. It's something that appeals to people from all cultures because they distill very fundamentally human patterns and needs from their research.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the fact that I guess the people they were talking to and they were involving in this were really diverse. They recognized that there are fundamental human values which are involved and which sort of create a certain, or make a certain product more intuitive or a certain product more desirable than another. Mm-hmm. So that's as well, as much as you look into the individual's perspective, you always try to draw generalizations from it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, to wrap up, you actually can put yourself in uncomfortable situations first. You can do stuff that you otherwise wouldn't, and that even involves taking a different way to work. It's a really simple thing, because it's just about trying to break your daily conventions. Or think about why you brush your teeth the way you do, or why you load the dishwasher the way you do, or why you wash your clothes the way you do. It's simple, really irrelevant tasks. Mm-hmm. That when you think of them anew, actually they create a mindset for you to question the work that you do.
It's really cool.
And it's just that mindset that you need in order to be more innovative. It's really that mindset of being able to question very conventional, very daily and routinely tasks.
And you can also justify it to yourself by saying, "Oh, I'm trying to get into design thinking. I'm trying this new method." You know, so you have something to tell yourself also. Cool.
So it's if you're really trying to learn something, if you're really trying to master a certain skill or a certain activity, you also have to look at the community. You'll be inevitably involved in that. So if you want to become a musician, it's quite likely that you'll hang out with more people from the music scene. But it's essential because that will also open your mind towards new ways of seeing the world. However, if you are, say, in one of your patterns, the best way to break out of it is actually to experience a new culture. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean that you have to move to another country. It's enough if you move into another social circle for a while. Yeah. So that can be another way of doing it, just talk to people which are sort of perhaps in your social circle, but which you never talk to, for example, just to see what happens.
Interesting, because often we do, we assume things about people where we just say, this person is not really interesting to me, I could never learn something from them.
Exactly. So this is one basic example. There's more though. If you look at design thinking as a method, you will find that we're all about constraints and we're all about redefining problems and trying to discover the core ideas. Now people perhaps think that that's paradox. You put constraints, but you also want people to remove their own constraints. How does that make sense? The reason is that the constraints you assume are solution and problem focused. So on the one hand, they deal with the context of the problem, and on the other hand, they're purely instrumental. Whereas the constraints that we have in our minds, they're very personal and sometimes emotional. You sometimes have a very, say, cheap, not very valuable objects that you just don't want to throw away. Why? Because we have our personal associations and constraints that make us feel that way. And it can also be positive. You would be able to have affection for something which other people find absolutely meaningless. But that means that this personal angle is sometimes very limiting, as in it really it hinders you from developing new ideas and thoughts. Yeah. So getting rid of it for a while for the problem solving process is actually very productive.